Hi, my name's Kirsty Page, and in this video, we're going to look at the skills that feed directly into phonic readiness, that underpin a child's readiness, but also can be sources of gaps that will act as barriers to readiness and progression. We're going to spend most of the time talking about very specific skills that I need to systematically prepare in with children through my preparation diet. And as we've already mentioned in the newsletter, we're going to want to consider a more holistic and wider range of skills than we're traditionally encouraged to. And as we systematically prepare those skills, for those of you with Launchpad, we will be looking at which skills, and we'll be looking at trying to lift those skills from the bottom of the yellow bit of the Launchpad skills framework to the top of the yellow bit. We're also within that going to talk about what is ready. You know, everybody talks about readiness. This child's ready, this child's not ready. It's very important that we get our children ready, but people rarely clarify and quantify what readiness is. What is it that I am working towards if I'm working with the younger children and trying to get as many of my children ready and to that point as possible? But also, if I am saying a child is not ready when I'm beginning to that formal teaching of phonics, what does that not readiness look like? Can I clarify and quantify which skills is that child not ready with? Are they not ready with them all, or are they ready with some but have got gaps with others? But before we talk about those very specific skills that incrementally need to be put in place, I also want to draw our attention to core foundation skills. And this is really important if I'm working with the younger children. So if I'm working in a PVI setting and I'm working with the 0 to 2s, or if I've got a 2-year-old provision attached to my school, then the phonic journey doesn't begin with the development of very specific skills. It begins with the need to put these real core foundation skills in place. And that's not separate from phonic preparation. That is part of phonic preparation and part of the child's preparation journey. And I shouldn't see it as separate. But also, if these skills are not in place, then it's not productive to be moving on to those higher level, more specific skills, because these foundation skills won't just lay the foundations for phonics, they will lay the foundations for how children engage with people and the learning environment and wider learning experiences. If I've got older children who have got more specific and significant needs, if I'm working in a specialist provision and my children are still at very early levels of success, even though they're older, it might be that for some of my children or with certain learning pathways, that the core foundation skills are what we're working on with certain children, and we see that this is not just underpinning wider learning, but this is actually part of phonic preparation as well. So let's just quickly have a look at what some of them are. We will revisit these skills in more detail when we talk about speech, language, and communication and children with more significant needs in future newsletters. Of course, I want my children to have very early and basic listening skills in place. So they would be aware of sounds in the environment around them. If they heard a car, they would know that it was attached, that noise was attached to a car. They would match that sound and object in the world around them. And in an ideal world, I would like them to be able to listen when they're not just following their own agenda, but they're beginning to listen to my agenda too. I'd like them to learn and know how to take turns. And initially, that will be on a one-to-one with an adult, but certainly from the age of 3, if part of my systematic preparation is going to be used to use small group learning activities, I need my children to have the listening and the turn taking and the early group skills putting in place in really simplistic ways as the child works towards that. before they hit more systematic activities. And for those of you with Launchpad, obviously auditory attention and very early auditory skills are in the red bit at the left of the skills framework, and turn taking and early group skills will be down at the bottom in the pragmatic purple section of Launchpad. Of course, I want my children to have the basics of language in place in relation to phonics. This will be so that they can understand the instructions and the language that I'm using around my preparation activities, and also so that they can begin to offer language and expressive language themselves. So that later on, if I want my children to move into writing, they can not just understand what I am saying, but they can formulate their own sentences and ideas as well. And of course, ideally, I would like the building blocks of speech sounds to be being put in place, because obviously, a little bit further down the line, I want my children to be able to articulate a wide range of sounds as we move into phonic teaching later on. Now, of course, phonological awareness is going to be crucial in the systematic preparation part of this recording and of my early years practice. But it's important that my younger children have those rhythm and music and song and rhyme experiences. When children are younger or when they're older but are at still very early levels of developmental success, we find that those songs and rhymes and rhythm activities are really useful for putting interaction and early language skills in place, and for developing motor skills and coordination skills. And that later on, those very same family of activities will be useful for building very specific skills, such as rhythm and syllable skills or rhyming skills. But they have a place in my very early practice. But often the skills that I'm wanting to lay down, the skills that I'm wanting to build and facilitate, will be much earlier when I share these experiences with my younger children or my children at earlier levels of success. And of course, I want my children to have a level of visual skills so that they can recognize objects and notice differences in color and size and sheen and pattern. And I want my children to have motor skills so that they can not only reach for objects, but they can pick them up and utilize them and transfer objects from hand to hand. And of course, once children get a little bit older, I'll want to systematically prepare those fine motor skills to get them to a point of readiness with writing. But of course, putting the basics in place is where it all begins. Let's jump now more to think, though, about those very specific skills that I want to lift and prepare to get my children ready as and when those core foundations are in place. And one of those skills kind of comes out of that very early listening work that we talked about before, and that is the very specific skill of auditory discrimination. And I've put this in red because for those of you with Launchpad, this will be the second red skill strand on the skills framework. And we lift children through a sequence of incremental skill steps where we lift them from being able to process environmental sounds, musical sounds, animal sounds, human sounds, transport sounds, to processing to processing the differences between words, and then eventually to that point that I want to get them to as I work towards readiness, which will be where they can begin to discriminate parts of words. And within this, of course, children will have the opportunity, within that kind of auditory discrimination preparation, they will need to understand what certain concepts mean, but also the flip side of that is those opportunities for listening also create great opportunities for me to build conceptual understanding. So when we're actually sharing experiences with children, we're rarely ever building just one thing. So as we share those listening experiences, I'm building understanding, and I'm moving on and needing my children to then understand comparison concepts, so things that can look the same, look different, but they can also sound the same and sound different. And also they can sound nearly the same, which is a really important thing for children to move on to understand. Because if you're thinking about cat and mat, of course they rhyme, but they don't sound the same. They sound nearly the same. B and D don't look the same, but they look nearly the same. So this is a really important journey of a family of concepts that I need to take my children on. They're going to need those sequential positional concepts so that they can understand where a sound is positioned in a word. Of course, I begin by understanding these concepts in relation to real life, real objects, lines of people, for example. But that's really important. And then later on, this idea that that sound might be at the beginning, but this sound is next. Crucial for children's understanding. And of course, all of the sounds that come around describing sounds, loud, quiet, but also that sounds can be long and sounds can be short as well. And really, if we go back to auditory discrimination, what do I want my children to be able to do to be able to confidently say that they are ready? In an ideal world, I want them to be able to hear sounds at the beginning of words. So if I say to a child, "Ooh, pen, I've got a pen," what sounds at the beginning of pen? Then ideally they'd be able to tell me that it is a p. But I'd also like them to be able to do that with a wide range of sounds. Um, so that if I said, "Ooh, I've got a cup," what sounds at the beginning of cup? That they would still be able to hear that it was a k. And what we find is that some speech sounds are easier to hear than others. So sounds like p, b, are easier for children to discriminate because as well as hearing them, they can see them when a person uses those sounds. So of course, that's lovely to know because it's a really good way to get things started with children. But I would like them to be able to listen to a wider range of sounds as well to say that they are ready. So for those of you with Launchpad, just a little tip here. When we're talking about readiness, really what we're talking about is the skill step in that skill strand that sits at the top of the yellow systematic preparation phase. So my preparation journey in an ideal world is lifting them from the bottom of the yellow, if the core foundation skills are in place, to the top of the yellow, which would be where I would judge readiness. But of course, I want my children also to have sequential auditory memory. I don't want them to be able to just discriminate and identify one sound. I want them to be able to hear two musical instrument sounds and to be able to copy the two that I've heard. I would ideally like them to be able to copy them in the right order. So this is auditory memory is about building capacity. How many sounds can you hold? And sequential auditory memory is about holding them in the right order. And for a point of readiness, I would like my children to have shared those experiences and incrementally built their skills so that they could hold a sequence of at least three in the right order, and that will very much underpin blending. Another way I can build auditory memory, and a great way to build auditory memory, is with language, with words. And for those of you with Launchpad, this will auditory memory for understanding is the first kind of orange column. So after the red on Launchpad, the first column for receptive language. And it's all about a child's increasing ability with familiar vocabulary to hold an increasing number of words in their auditory memory so that they can process that language and understand what has been said. And then the sequential aspect of it is being able to hold words, but also hold them in the right order. Now, gaps with this and working on this skill are really important. This paves the way for blending. It paves the way from being able to hold language and words and sounds for writing. So from a phonic point of view, it's a pretty important skill. But this is about language processing. This is also about wider learning. It will impact other areas of literacy, but it will also impact children's learning across the curriculum. So this is very much a skills round I definitely want to have in my preparation diet, because if children have gaps with this, it will cause them all sorts of learning barriers. And the good thing is I'm working on phonic preparation, but I'm working on language at the same time. I don't necessarily have to separate those two things out. And what do I want for my children to be ready by the time, if we're thinking about when we start children in England for the formal journey of phonic learning? From a language point of view, children should be able to hold 4 familiar words in their auditory memory and understand language at that level. And ideally, they should be able to hold 4 words in the right order. And that will give them a great grounding for understanding instructions, classroom language, stories, language of learning. From a blending point of view, children need to be able to hold at least 3 words, 3 familiar words in the right order. So if you are thinking about a child and I'm saying p, e, and the child is not able to blend it, one of the reasons they might not be able to blend, and this is the reason for many children, is that they haven't got that sequential auditory memory to hold the sounds. So it's not just a blending issue, it's actually that they haven't got the underpinning sequential auditory memory that they need. We've already mentioned concepts when we talked about auditory discrimination. So again, we talked about how those sequential positional, things like beginning, middle, and end are pretty important. Those concepts of comparison, same, different, nearly the same. Those auditory concepts, loud, quiet, long, short sounds, but also as well directional concepts, things like up, down, round, and across. And other concepts related to writing, things like top and bottom, are really important if we want our children to be able to understand the language that our writing teaching will place on them, to understand letter writing, mantras, and other language around writing. So conceptual understanding is coloured kind of like a yellowy orange here, because on Launchpad it's the yellow bit, but the pure yellow on the PowerPoint doesn't work very well. And what would I like my children to know if they are ready? And here we've obviously got to consider our children who are newer to English as well. That we might need to backtrack and put some of this conceptual understanding in place. It's not just about recognizing flashcards. That we, in an ideal world, would like our children to understand all of the words I'm going to use around phonics and wider writing, but to understand them initially in a real world concrete way, so that when I begin to use these words in a more abstract way, children have got that background understanding of what these words mean in a more concrete way before I ask them to use them in a more abstract way. And it might be that I've started to use some of these concepts anyway in a more abstract way as we've started to get our children ready. And in relation to those directional concepts that underpin writing, I want to use them, but also make sure my children understand them as we're drawing and making marks together. Because if we're thinking about things like up and down, most of the time that I use those concepts, and most of the time that children understand those concepts, might be things like when they're going up and down the slide, where it's in the vertical plane. When we're drawing and mark making, and later on when we move into writing, when I say up and down, I'm using those concepts in the horizontal plane, and it's just slightly different. So I need to make sure my children understand those concepts in both of those ways, because that's quite important. Now, some people would say that phonological awareness beyond blending and segmenting isn't important. But I, as an ex-speech and language therapist, would differ. And also, if I want my children to move on beyond the very basics of phonics and have wider literacy skills, um, then phonological awareness really gives them that grounding. And we find that children, even those children who are ready quite quickly, if they've got that grounding in phonological skill, they can go on to tackle longer words, multisyllabic words, as, for both reading and for writing it in a way that they wouldn't be able to do without that phonological awareness grounding. And also phonological awareness, we're thinking about it here in relation to phonics, but it's hugely important for speech sound development. So we really don't want to cut our cloth too thinly. Now, in terms of phonological awareness, I'd like them to have those rhythm and syllable skills to pave the way for kind of moving on with literacy and moving on with phonics, but also for speech sounds. And ideally, I'd like them to be able to clap out words. I'd like them to also be able to count the claps as they clap words out or after they've clapped out a word, which is also really good for early maths. Some people would say rhyming's not important, but it is. It's not just important so that children can move on and write poems. Of course, they'll need the skill for that as well. But rhyming is important for speech sound development. And it's just a real good measure of how well a child's phonological storage of words is. So, of course, I would like my children at a minimum to be able to hear and detect words that rhyme. But the creme de la creme of readiness would be that my children would be able to generate a rhyming word string. And that shows me not only can they listen to and make decisions about how words sound and whether they sound nearly the same or not, but they can also manipulate words in that way. So if a child is able to say smelly, welly, jelly, pelly, then it is showing me that they've got quite advanced phonological skills. And that's another reason why we look out for skills like that. Of course, auditory blending is important because auditory blending will underpin children's ability to read words using the phonic approach. Launchpad tells us how that skill develops. It doesn't actually begin with phonemes, it begins with bigger units of sound, which children will be able to listen to, hold, and then blend together. But of course, for readiness, I would like my children to be able to blend at CVC level with a wide range of speech sounds, including short, sharp vowels and short, sharp consonants. So I'm not talking about being able to read. I am saying if I've got a feely bag and I say to a child, I've got a they know that I've got a pen in my feely bag. And phoneme identification isn't necessarily a skill that I'm going to necessarily want before I start teaching children phonics, but it's a skill that I want to see quite quickly developing alongside. And phoneme identification is a depth of skill that will allow my children to move into independent writing. So when I said back at the beginning in relation to auditory discrimination, I've got a pen, what sounds at the beginning of pen, and if the child could say that it was a p, that would be auditory discrimination of the initial phoneme, which is a level of readiness. But what I also want children to be able to do is not have to watch me, not have to listen to me all the time. I want them to be able to think of a word and either say it to themselves in their heads or say it out loud. And I want them to be able to work towards identifying what sounds are in that word from their own productions of words. And so that's why this skill is so important. And it is really why some children need that dictation and an adult to give them the words and almost like give them the sounds, whereas other children can write independently. Obviously, auditory memory and language plays a great role as well, but Phoneme identification is often a hidden barrier that we rarely think about. And speech and language therapists will look at phoneme identification skills in children with speech sound changes as well. They'll look at auditory discrimination and phoneme identification. Of course, I want my children to have visual skills, and on Launchpad, that will be the purple, one of the purple bits. We've got various shades of purple on the skills framework. And we know that we need to take our children on an early years journey, or even with older children where we're needing to backtrack, take them on that visual journey where we process objects with big differences, smaller differences, then kind of being able to cope with picture material of increasing complexity, logos, symbols, shapes, numbers, and of course we want our children to work towards a point where they can recognize letters. And so in terms of readiness, I'm not talking about do children know letters now, or do they, we're not looking for what they haven't been taught. We're looking for visual skill. But if I do have a child who can do things like recognize their name, can already recognize and know a few letters, then chances are their visual skills are going to be okay, because otherwise they wouldn't be demonstrating and be able to do those things. But if I am less sure, how do I judge readiness? And bearing in mind we haven't taught children any letters yet, and nor should we have taught them their letters yet. But what I would like my children to be able to do before I get my flashcards out and before I assume children are visually ready when they might not be, is I would like my children to be able to look at and sort out different letters and put the ones that are the same together and put the ones that are different with the ones that they look like. So it might be that I have 4 different letters, but quite a few of each letter, and we've got to kind of put all the S's over here, we've got to put all the L's over here and all the T's over here. Um, and all the I's here and all the J's here, and they're all mixed up, and we've got to look at them and sort them out. So I'm not saying that do the children know what that letter is? Do they know the sound it makes? That learning will come later. But are they ready for that learning? They are visually ready if they can see the sameness of the letters and the difference of the letters. And even when letters are similar, like L and T or I and J, we can see that the child can see the I-ness of I and the J-ness of J, and that yes, they might look very similar, but they are not the same. And then later on, that will show us that they've got the discrimination skills to underpin learning and remembering those letters, that phonic knowledge. Ideally, I'd like my children also to be able to have visual memory skills with groups of objects. On Launchpad, we talk about playing Kim's game so that children don't just look at one thing at a time. They can look at a group of objects and then identify which one is missing. And ideally, as well as having some sequential auditory memory skill, I'd like them to have some sequential visual skill as well, so that they can look at and then copy patterns that they have seen but which have since been removed. And ideally, I'd like them to be able to remember a visual sequence of 3, and that will underpin children's ability to move on to digraphs and trigraphs, but word level reading as well, and to move on to 2-digit numbers and 3-digit numbers as they get further into maths learning. And of course, fine motor is important, gross motor is important, but if we're thinking about writing readiness, ideally we've kind of put in that foundation of gross motor and coordination and core motor skills. And now we're looking for the systematic preparation of particular fine motor skills. And really, it helps if I'm thinking about fine motor in relation to hand-eye coordination, manipulative skill, finger and hand strength, but also having an increasing awareness of left to right tracking, which is a visual as well as a motor skill. And really, how do I judge whether a child is ready? Remember with phonics, we're not just teaching children to read, we're teaching children to write and form these letters and begin to move into writing words at the same time. So, can my children do things like cut with scissors when they're drawing? Are they using a range of movements? Can they go up a line and then retrace a line? Can they go up a line and then change direction? These are the movements that they will be expected to write as they form all but the simplest of letters. And even simple letters will involve circles and curves. Can they copy simple shapes, waves, tunnels? Can they copy circles, half circles, both directions? Um, so again, I'm not necessarily judging writing readiness on their writing. I'm looking at the fine motor and the skills that will underpin writing. And of course, if my children have got at least a cluster, if not a conventional grip, that is great. But again, the grip will influence how well they can cope with those changes of directions and retracings and things. And of course, remembering that to judge writing readiness is not just about fine motor, it's also about, do children understand those directional concepts that will be used in my language, in my instructions, and maybe used in the letter writing mantras that my phonic program uses. So we've had a whistle-stop tour of phonic preparation there. Of course, we can see there's a lot to it, but also a lot of this is stuff that we will know and be doing already. It's just about having a systematic approach, but also being able to look for gaps when these skills are not in place, alongside the formal teaching of phonics, but also where children are younger and we're preparing, we can take children's differing starting points with these skills into consideration. We don't necessarily have a one size fits all approach to phonic preparation. We understand what we want to achieve and how that develops, and then we go from where our children are. So if you want to receive future newsletters, if you're not getting them already, or if you want to get back copies, then you can email toolkit@launchpadforliteracy.co.uk and we will sort that out for you. Thank you very much.